Okay, so you guys have been working on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Um, so, we go through this material pretty quickly, especially HTML and CSS. CSS is one of those things where you can spend lots and lots of time doing it. You can, you can, it's like, regex or something. It's fairly easy to have a basic knowledge and then fairly difficult to have like a really detailed practical skill with it. Um, but the basics is good enough. And there are also libraries. We haven't introduced those yet. There are also CSS libraries that can make things a little simpler, give you basically some boilerplate and a framework. So things like Bootstrap, might as well just show you that real quick. There's a whole bunch of these CSS libraries. Bootstrap is one of them. And let's see. It's basically what it is a CSS file that you download, and it's got a bunch of classes already built into it, and then you just use them. So that's basically just what it is. Let's see if we can find some examples. Let's see, form. Here's a select form. So this is CSS, and it gives you a bunch of classes. So one of them is called form-select. That's just what they called it. And then the option selected, blah, blah, blah. So this is it. So you could write your own CSS to make a form like this, but it's ready made. And if you don't really care that much about the particular customizations, then this can be a convenient time-saving thing. But what we're going to talk about today is APIs. So does anyone know what an API is?
Application
The
programming interface.
Yep, yeah, application programming interface. So, you know, how would you explain that to someone who doesn't know what that means?
If I understand it correctly, and I may not, so you like send off a request to this API and it will send you back data.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's basically just a way to get data. Um, so it's often the case that if you built, let's say, a static HTML site like you've been doing, you might want to get some other data that you don't want to hard code into your HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So an API is just a way, in general, it's just a way to get extra information, especially dynamic information that might change on a daily basis or second basis or whatever. So API application programming interface, just in general, is just it just means the way you interact with something. So there's a general term API which could be used for basically anything in programming. So if you have a function and the function takes two integers, I mean that's basically an API, right? So the API for the function is, I write the function name, I write parentheses, and I pass in two integers. That's how you use it, from the outside. Um, There's also a more specific usage of API, which basically means an HTTP interface. And an API is almost always an interface between an HTTP client, like your browser, and a database. And we're going to talk about databases later on in the course, but the API is just a layer in between that allows your browser to indirectly get information and send information to a database. So we'll look at doing that in the browser using JavaScript. But before we do that, we're going to use a tool called Postman. And you know, you don't have to use Postman exactly. I think it's a pretty convenient tool. So this will allow you to make it's basically just another client. So it's like a browser or curl. These are all HTTP clients. So if I want to go to so so if I want to go to example.com, I can use curl example.com. And what do I get back? I get back an HTML document. But my command line doesn't really know, it doesn't know how to present HTML and CSS. So it just gives me the actual response, which is this HTML document. Whereas if I go to the same example.com, my browser, it's basically the same request and the same response, but my browser knows how to display it. So I can open up the DevTools here. If I go to the Elements tab, you can see that HTML document right there. So HTML, and then HTML document has two children, a head and a body. Inside the body, we have this div, and inside the div, we have an H1 tag and then a couple of P tags. And inside this P tag, there's an A tag. So here's the HTML document, which is a tree, and it's being rendered by the browser because that's what the browser is designed to do. It's designed to understand and render HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We can also use curl example.com. We can pass it a -v flag. And -v, this is a common flag, means verbose. So it's just going to give you more information. So if we look up here at the request now with -v, you can see that at the end, we still get the same HTML document, but we can see a little bit more lower level detail about what's happening. So when my client, in this case, curl, makes a request, it sends an HTTP request to this endpoint, it has to follow a particular protocol. And the protocol is something like this. We'll see more of this later. But the protocol is just a particular format. You can think of it as like a form. So you have to fill out a form and include some mandatory information and then some optional information. So here's what my client sent as the request. And then after that, there's a new line. And then we have this other chunk here. And this is the response. So this is what the server sent back to me. My client made the request with a particular format following this HTTP protocol, and then it gets a response. And the response has some information like, for example, 200. So there's a whole series of codes that indicate, the status of the request. In this case, it was a good request, like the server understands what to do with it. And then we have a bunch of headers, age, cache control, blah, blah, blah. Most of these are optional. You can also have requests with lots more parameters or headers, but this is basically it. And then there's another new line, and then we get the actual content. So HTTP clients understand this protocol, this back and forth. And the same thing happens in the browser. And we can also use a client here. So if I go to example.com, so I'm using Postman now. We get the same thing, except Postman is a developer tool. So it gives you more control. So in the browser, when I make a request to example.com, it's very user friendly. but I don't have very much control over, what headers I'm sending, how it's going to be, how the response is going to be formatted and stuff like that. But here in Postman, because it's a developer tool, you get a little more control. So you can see that the response looks like that curl response, where this is just the raw information. And we can see in the headers, so it displays the headers nicely in an easy to read way. And then we can do, let's see, yeah, preview. Preview will actually render, in this case, the HTML. So that's a basic idea. Postman is just another HTTP client. What it's used for typically is not just making normal requests for HTML, but what kind of response do you typically get from an API? So if I go to a normal website, the response is going to be an HTML document. But if I want to go to an API to get, let's say, more specialized information about something, what's the format of that response going to be?
Isn't it usually JSON?
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost always JSON. It doesn't have to be. There are other things. There's XML, there's other things, but JSON is what you're going to get 99% of the time. So what is JSON?
It's basically just a nested dictionary.
Yeah, it can be a dictionary. So it doesn't actually have to be. It could be basically an array or a dictionary. But yeah, it's a particular format. So there's a standard and there's a format. Uh, and if you follow the format, which is specified somewhere, then you can write a parsing library that will understand that JSON object and transform that into your application code. So whether you're using Python or JavaScript or C++ or whatever, you can send an HTTP request, which is just going to be bytes, basically like a string. You can send a formatted request, you can get a response, which will include JSON, and then your application code can parse that JSON and turn that JSON into code, into something that your code can understand and deal with. So let's look at an example. So yeah, so I like to use this JSON placeholder.typico.com, which is also in the README. But this is a nice, convenient, free, simple to use thing. It's just a free endpoint you can use. And if you come here to the documentation, you can see that there are a few different endpoints you can hit. There's posts / comments / albums, whatever. And I can actually go to that. So I'll go to users right now. And here is the full URL. It's whatever the base URL is plus / users. And what I get is, in this case, a list. So this is a JSON object, but it's a list of objects. Now this is not like a web page that anyone would want to see, but you can use this information inside of your application. You can take specific bits of information that you need, and then you can process it and turn it into HTML and display it on your page. So we'll just take a look in the DevTools real quick. So I'm going to make this request again. I'm going to go to the network tab this time. And I'm going to make this request again. You can see I made the request to /users. And in Google, Chrome or every browser will have this, but you can see information, more detailed information about the request. So the headers, so here's the there's the response and the request. So if we look at the request first, so I went to JSON placeholder blah blah blah.com. I made a GET request. We'll talk about this later. And the path is /user. So we have the base URL and then a further specification in this case /users. And there's a bunch of other headers, which you can see here. And the user agent in this case is my browser. And let's look at the response header. So this is what the server is sending back to my client. And you can see, let's see if we can find the type. It doesn't, where's the, looking for the type here. Oh, all right, so let me try making the same request right here using Postman. So go to /users. I can just click on this, there we go. Right, here we go is the content type. That's a header I was looking for. So content type in this case is going to be application JSON. If I go to example.com, look at the headers, the content type is text HTML. So this is just a header that tells the client what it's about to get. So looking at this request, so my client makes the request, it gets a response, and this is basically metadata for the response. And it says in this case, hey, I'm going to give you text or an HTML document. And that basically just gives the client a heads up for what follows. Like, how do I interpret whatever gets sent next? In this case, it's HTML.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
You
Any
have to
questions?
secure anything for this? So like when you're transferring, is there like any like security issues or
Yeah, there definitely can be. So the example, example.com, if it is not secured. So example, you can see actually, is it secure now? I thought that this was not. Let me see. Okay, so this actually is. Let me see if I can go to HTTP. Okay, so they have a secure and an insecure version of this. So if I just go to HTTP without the S, not every website will do this. Most websites now will, if you go to HTTP, it'll just basically reroute you to HTTPS. But in this case, you can see that, and there's no certificate. So if there's no certificate, the certificate is used to encrypt data that's sent back and forth. So if there's no certificate, that means there's no encryption, which means that anyone who is on the network or has access to the network can do what's called packet sniffing. And here's a tool right here, which I have called Wireshark. If you want to play around with Wireshark, you can, if you want to be overwhelmed with all of the things that are actually happening under the hood, this is a good thing to look at. But yeah, so if we're like, in a coffee shop and we're all on a Wi-Fi network and the Wi-Fi network is not secured and you're sending HTTP traffic, anyone, in that coffee shop would be able to see what you're sending. All right. So here we've got JSON. So that's basically it. So we can use Postman to investigate. So Postman is especially good when you're developing. So it allows you to narrow to basically break up what you're doing into different chunks. So typically when you're writing a full, a web application, you have a database and a front end and an API layer and all kinds of other things going on. And if you want to, add something or test something, you always want to isolate it into, so so you don't have 30 things that could possibly have gone wrong. You just have one thing that could possibly have gone wrong. So that's what it's for, and that's why you would use something like Postman. All right. So now that we're familiar with this tool and what an API is, and let me just also say that an API is, I mentioned earlier, an API is basically an interface to a database somewhere. So, I have a client, an HTTP client. I send a request to this server. This server will take this request and process it and say, oh, you want to go to /users. Okay, well, let me call a function that handles requests to /users and any other information that might be included. Like, for example, /users/1. So now I just get one user instead of a list of users. So this request will get parsed by the API, and then that parsed request will then make a connection to a database, and that connection to the database will retrieve the specific information that you're asking for. In this case, I want information about this user. So the database will send a response to the API, and then the API will take that information from the database and then package it up into a JSON object and then send you back the JSON object. So that's kind of what's actually happening, and you guys will implement all of this yourself later. So you guys will actually implement, you'll have your web server, you'll have an API which you will write, and you'll have a database which you will create. So you'll not just be consuming APIs, but you'll actually write them. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in code. So we ultimately want to use this stuff in HTML page. So I'm going to open up an example. And I'm going to copy this. All right, and I'm going to use live server. If I would recommend installing live server if you haven't already. It's pretty convenient. If you have another tool that you like to use, that's also fine. But so live server is an extension. So you could go here to extensions and live server. And here's the one that you would install. Okay. So I'm going to right click here, open with live server, and this is going to spin up a local server. So running on port 5500. You guys will get more experience understanding what all this stuff means later, but here is the HTML document. And I can open up DevTools again, and I can see here's the div, which is a container, and then I have this section, and then another div, and blah, blah, blah. So here's where it says current temperature in Chicago. And then I have this P tag right here, which is currently not displaying anything, but I could add a temperature here. So I'll just say 30. And if I save that, it will do a hot reload. And I see that, the temperature in Chicago is 30 degrees, let's say. All right, so that doesn't look very good. So let's add CSS. I'll copy this. I'll call this styles.css. You can call these files whatever you want. These are kind of conventional names. And then I already have a link here. So the HTML document knows that it's supposed to pull this CSS file. So that should be displaying now. And now it looks a little better. You can see current temperature in Chicago, 30. Right? So this is a static web page. It works. It's great. But I don't know what the temperature in Chicago is. And the temperature in Chicago changes constantly. So if I wanted to host a web page that gave you the current temperature in Chicago, I would have to, every, I don't know, minute or every hour or whatever cadence I wanted to use, I would have to figure out, find out what the temperature in Chicago is, and then modify this HTML document and then re-upload it to my server. So I would have to constantly be updating the HTML page because this is static. Like I had to hard code this value. So we don't want to hard code this value. We want this to display whatever the current temperature happens to be, and I don't want to have to worry about it. I don't have to re-upload an HTML document to my server every time the temperature changes. So we can use the fetch API. So instead of using the browser, for example, so I'm going to grab this endpoint right here. I can go into Postman. I'm going to make this request. And you can see that we get a JSON response. And this JSON response has a bunch of different information in it, most of which I don't need, but it does have the temperature right here. So negative 4.1 degrees, presumably Celsius. And if we look at the URL here, we have the base URL, which is api.open-mateo.com, and then we have some further specification. So /v1, so this is version 1 of the API, and then forecast, and then there's a question mark and some other stuff. So does anyone know what all this stuff is?
They're like parameters for the request. So those are like things you can change.
Yeah, exactly. So these are query parameters. So what's the format for a query parameter?
I think it just starts with a question mark and then you separate them with ampersands.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And the them is a key value pair. So we're basically saying I want to go to this endpoint and I want to get some more specific information. I want my request to be, very specific. So I, you know, include a question mark and then key value pair separated by an equal sign. So this is like a dictionary. It's latitude 41, longitude, blah, 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 and current weather is true. So the API from here, the code there knows how to handle this. The code there knows to check, okay, are there any query parameters? If so, I'm going to pull those out. I'm going to look at those values, and I'm going to use those values when I make a request to the database to give back this information. So, I don't have access to that database or anything like that. I have just the application interface. I just have the interface. So the only thing I can do is format my request, and then I have to rely on whatever internal stuff is happening over there to ultimately give me a response. So how do I know which parameters I can send, well, it's not, it's not obvious or magical or anything. It's something you would have to look up. So I'm going to go to openmateo.com. So if you want, a free weather API, you do whatever internet searching you want to do and try to find one. And once you find one, you need to figure out how to use it. So pretty much every API is going to follow a specific format. This is called REST. So a REST API. And it basically just, it's basically just a particular format, like, as you see. So the request URL looks a certain way, right? We can go deeper and deeper, like a file structure, and get more specific, and then we can pass query parameters and do other things as well. But here we can take a look at it. So I'm going to check out the documentation. And if you're not familiar with this kind of thing, this can be very overwhelming. So this documentation, I would say, is actually pretty good. It's not presented very well, but the information is good. So here we have API documentation, and the API endpoint /v1/forecast accepts a geographical coordinate, a list of weather variables, and responds with a JSON hourly weather forecast for 7 days. Blah, 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 blah. So you can see /v1/forecast, and if we go here, /v1/forecast. So this is going to be, all this information is basically stuff you can further specify when you make a request to this endpoint. So for example, latitude and longitude, which I have here. So these are parameters, query parameters, latitude and longitude. And let's see if we can get a different one. So we could get something like a temperature unit. So let's say it looks like it's in Celsius now. Let's see if we can get Fahrenheit instead. So I'm going to add another query parameter here. Oops. And equals Fahrenheit, if I spell that correctly. Probably not, but we'll see if it works. So right now it's -4.1. If I send this request again, yeah. Try to spell this. Let's see. We did something. Temperature unit, string, Celsius, Fahrenheit. So let me try getting rid of this guy. Cannot initialize temperature unit. So this is part of the process. This is why I use a tool like Postman, because you're going to have an API, and then you figure out how to use it, and you figure out what information you want and how to get it. But you have to, go through this process of playing around with it, because each one is a little bit different.
Just need an H in front of the R in Fahrenheit.
Yeah, you beat me to it.
Yeah, it's spelled like the German word fahren, to drive. It's like the kind of drivingness, essentially.
Okay. So the error message actually contains the misspelled word. So it's misspelled in the error message. Okay. Okay, so now I get this, and let's see if actually this is the default. Let me see. Copy this. Yeah, okay. So that worked now. Had to play around with it, which is not uncommon. Made a stupid mistake and misspelling the word, and then also have to play around and make sure. So, for example, looks like you have to include current weather equals true, and blah blah blah. So you have to play around with stuff to get it to do what you want. But now the temperature is in Fahrenheit. Okay, so you have a web application. You decide, hey, I need to get the weather dynamically. You either create your own or find an API that you can use. In this case, we'll just use free APIs. You also have to deal with API keys and stuff, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So you find an API, you figure out, you look through the documentation, you play around with it in Postman. And then once you figure out, okay, this is the information that I want, and this is how I can get it, now we can try to basically inject this information into the application. So how do we do that? We use something called the fetch API. And you can read up on this here, but this is not strictly like a JavaScript thing. This is, an API. It's called the fetch API. And in the context of the browser, this basically just means like extensions. Things that each browser will implement that your JavaScript code can use. So this is not something that's in JavaScript as such. It's something that's in the browser, and when your code runs in the browser, it's almost like the standard library in Python, where you can import, import the string module, or import like the functools module, or whatever other module you're going to use. And we can take a look. Let's see. Using fetch. So here's an example. So it says the fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the protocol, the HTTP protocol, blah, 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 blah. So you don't need to worry about this, but here's an example of how to use it. So I don't even know if this is a real website. I'm curious if this actually returns anything. Yeah, so not really, but it's fine. So the format, so you call fetch, so it's a function that you can just call. You pass it in a string of the URL that you want to go to, and then you're going to get a response. It's going to return a response or something. So let's just see what that is real quick. So I'm going to go to example.com. And I'm going to open up the dev tools in the console. And then I'm going to grab this. And I'm going to save this as a variable. So const URL equals this. Okay, so now I'm going to fetch URL. And what do I get back? Something called a promise. So I'm not going to really talk about what a promise is right now. I'll do an optional lecture this afternoon to look at promises in more detail. So if you're interested in that, you can do that. It's something that you should, you really should be familiar with if you want to be, a web developer. But for now, we're just gonna skip the underlying complexity, and we'll just focus on how to use it. So this function returns a promise, and a promise is asynchronous. And asynchronous code is special in a few different ways, which I'll talk about later. But for now, this basically means that you have to treat it like this. So anything that's asynchronous if you want to use it, you have to mark your function with this async keyword. And then if you want to do something with this, so this returns a promise. If you want to do something later on with this, you have to include the await keyword. And then this will also be a promise. And then in order to, so you get, you make a request, but we want to parse the JSON out of the request. In our case, it doesn't always have to be JSON, but pretty much always is. So we're going to pull out the JSON, and this is also going to return a promise. And you know that because you have the await keyword here. And then at that point, we can actually use this value. So this will actually represent the JSON object that we care about. And once we have the JSON object that we care about, we can, in our case, pull out the temperature and then render it in the HTML. So I'm going to go back here real quick, and actually I'm going to copy the code from the README. Where is that? Sorry, README. Here we go. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it in here. So here's the function. And if I call fetch data, it will eventually, a promise is something that happens asynchronously. So it's something that will happen later at some point. Eventually, it will console log the JSON that we get back. So we have this asynchronous function, which means that this function is going to return a promise. We have the URL. We call fetch, which is also going to return a promise. And we want to parse through that response and pull out the JSON that we care about. And once we have the JSON that we care about, now we can do something with it. In this case, we're just console logging it. But what we actually want to do is pull out the temperature, which we'll get from current weather temperature. So let me see if we can do the up arrow here. Yeah. So now I don't want to, so if I just want to get the temperature, how do you imagine that I could console log the temperature? Not the whole thing, just the temperature.
Would it be JSON data dot temperature?
Yeah, so this JSON, this .json, basically will parse the JSON and convert it into a JavaScript object. So we can now JSON data it's an object. It's JavaScript code. So we can treat it just like JavaScript code. So dot current weather, and we further specify, because current weather is also an object, and temperature. Okay, so now I'm going to run fetch data again. And this time we just see the temperature that we care about. Okay, so now that we basically have the code to get the specific information that we care about, what we need to do next is to inject this into the JavaScript. So I'm going to switch back over to here, and I'm just going to copy this real quick. And then we'll talk about it. Okay, so I just added a JavaScript file. So I need to let my HTML know. And you do that with a script tag. And source equals. All right, so if I save that, now I go back, or open that. You can see that it's actually getting that temperature now dynamically. And it looks like it's updated every hour. So, you know, if I sat here for an hour refreshing this, I should probably see a change. So let's take a look at the code real quick. So this window.onload. So there are a whole bunch of events that you can listen for, right? In the browser. One of them is onload. There's also click, you know, there's a million different events, but onload. So once this document, HTML document is loaded, then we want to get other information to fill it in. So if I refresh this, you can see for a split second, it actually displays 30 because that's what I have hard coded here. So the page loads, it actually displays 30. And then once the page loads, this network request goes out, which takes, you know, I don't know, half a second or whatever to go out and come back and get parsed and then injected into the DOM. So we have fetch data. Fetch data is an async function. It's an asynchronous function. It follows the same pattern that you're going to follow 99% of the time, which is you call fetch with a URL, you parse the JSON out of it, and then you do something with that data. In this case, we're going to take that temperature, which is negative 4.4, and we want to grab an element, which we have here. So where's the temp? So the ID is temp here. So we're gonna grab that element, and then we're just gonna modify the inner text to include that piece of information. So that's pretty much it. You can follow this pattern without having really any idea what a promise is. And that's what we're going to do today for now. And if you happen to know more about it, that's great. And you should look into it on your own. And I will also do an optional lecture this afternoon looking at promises in more detail. But any questions about this? Okay. All right. Let me stop the recording.